Hey there, welcome to Reading the Bible, a video series from Redeemer Anglican Church. My name is Collin, I'm the lead pastor. In this time of social distancing, I want to help you and your family learn to love reading the Bible together. The thing is, I think many of us don't know how to approach reading the Bible. It's this strange book written thousands of years ago, and even though people like me keep telling you over and over again that you should read it with your families in your own homes, every time you open it up, you don't really get anything out of it. And if that's you, know that you're not alone, and I want to come alongside you and help. Because yes, this is a strange book written thousands of years ago, but I have come to believe that it is the most transformative work of literature that this world has ever known. And I want to help you and your family discover that as well. Now, if you're just joining us this week, you've missed a lot of our conversation so far. And so I invite you to look at the previous 4 weeks because we've been unpacking a lot of what it looks like to read the Bible and understand it. What we've said, this is by way of review, is that the Bible communicates a single unifying storyline. A story that shapes who we are and forms our identity as God's people. But if you open up the Bible, you can see that it's made up of many different books written by many different authors for different audiences and at different times over the course of really thousands of years. And each of those books, and even parts of those books, contribute to this main unifying storyline in a variety of different ways. And a lot of times when you open up a Bible and you start reading in a section, it's hard to discern how this fits in to that main storyline. And so over the past few weeks, we've been looking at one of these genres of literature. We're looking at the big 3 genres of literature that we find in the Bible. Last week, we started with narrative. This week, we're tackling poetry. And next week, we're going to be finishing up looking at what's known as discourse, or what many of us are familiar with when we talk about moral teaching. So last week we looked at narrative. We said that 50% of the Bible is actually story. We looked at how characters are used, how plot and how context is vitally important to understand what's going on in narratives in the Bible and how those narratives connect to the overarching narrative. This week we're going to be wading through the really murky waters of ancient Hebrew poetry. But reading poetry is vitally important if we're going to understand the Bible at all. Why? Because 50% of the Bible is story, but almost a third of your Bible is poetry. So together, 75% is either story or poetry. And so it's vitally important that we understand how to read poems in the Bible, because so much of the Bible is actually poetry. In fact, one nugget of information for you, God's actual speech to his people, so the words of God that he's speaking to his people, most often, like the majority of that speech from God is actually recorded as poetry. I think that's pretty incredible. And so it's very important that we understand how to read poetry. But we also have to recognize that it's difficult. It's difficult to read poetry in our culture, but in reading the Bible, we have to go to a different culture at a different time. And so it's difficult. And so just over the next few minutes, I want to give you some tools that can hopefully help you begin to read poetry in a new way. So let's dive on in. So to start this conversation, I think it's important that we actually begin by talking about what is the purpose for poetry, because it has a very different purpose than telling a story or engaging in some sort of moral discourse or instruction, didactic teaching. Because a lot of times we'll approach every part of the Bible as that the purpose of every part of the Bible is to communicate information, is to download information into our minds so that we can then live in a particular way. And on one degree, it's true. The Bible wants you to live in a particular way, and every author is kind of ushering you in that direction. But the way that they do that is different based on the genre of literature. And the primary purpose for poetry is not to communicate information. I'm reminded of the opening scene of the Dead Poets Society, right? When Robin Williams' character, he has them read the introduction to poetry from this very bland and dry textbook. And the author of that textbook starts saying, like, you can deduce the meaning or the importance of a poem by graphing it out, and it's got x-axis and y-axis, and it's all very mechanical. And then Robin Williams just says excrement, absolute excrement, and he has them rip out that page, because that's not what poetry is about. And a lot of times we approach poetry in an improper way as well. It's not about communicating information, like downloading it into your minds. The purpose of a poem is primarily to ignite your imagination. I came across a poem that actually ironically talks about what poetry is really all about. And it's a poem called The Introduction to Poetry by Billy Collins. And he writes this: I ask them to take a poem and hold it up to the light like a color slide, or press an ear against its hive. I say, drop a mouse into a poem and watch him probe his way out, or walk inside the poem's room and feel the walls for a light switch. I want them to water ski across the surface of a poem, waving at the author's name on the shore. But all they want to do is to tie the poem to a chair with rope and torture a confession out of it. They begin beating it with a hose to find out what it really means. You see, he's engaging in poetry by igniting your imagination using such vivid language, like he wants them to water ski across the surface of a poem. What does that even mean? You have to ponder it. You have to conjure up that image to see what connections the author is trying to make. And Billy Collins here is saying that all we want to do with poems so often is to torture a confession out of them. What do you mean? Just tell me the content. Tell me the significance. Tell me your teaching. But that's not the purpose of poetry in a broader sense, but specifically in our context here, that's not the purpose of biblical poetry. The purpose is to ignite your imagination, inviting you to ponder it slowly. To ponder something slowly and over many different angles. So now that we've kind of talked a little bit about the purpose for poetry, let's talk about some tools for actually reading the poems that we find in the Bible. Now, we know that poetry in our culture has a particular structure. Oftentimes, words will rhyme, and there's usually a cadence or a meter, sometimes it's called, right? Roses are red, violets are blue. There isn't a star as sparkling as you, right? We can see there's rhyme, there's a rhythm to it. But when we open up the poetry in the Bible, we open to the prophets, or we open to the book of Psalms, we don't find that structure. We don't find rhyming. But that's not to say that there isn't an intentional design to these poems that we find in the Bible. It's a different kind of poetry. This is Hebrew poetry, which comes at it at a very different way than our American or Western poetry. And at a basic level, the poets of the Hebrew people would use very often what's known as a couplet, which are two lines that are intentionally set beside each other. The first line will make the basic statement, and then the second line will develop that idea in some way. You'll find this all throughout the poetry in the Bible. And there's many different ways in which that second line can develop the basic idea. Oftentimes you'll see that the second line completes the idea of the first. So in Exodus chapter 15, and we have the Song of Moses after the people of God crossed the Red Sea. And you hear this: I will sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. You can see that's a couplet. I will sing to the Lord is the basic idea. And then to complete it though, why? For he has triumphed gloriously. It goes on, the horse and his rider, first line, he has thrown into the sea, completes the idea. Another way in which the second line can develop the idea of the first is that it can often intensify what's going on. So in Psalm 88, we can see that the writer is lamenting the absence of God. He's crying out to the Lord day and night. And he says this: is your steadfast love declared in the grave, or your faithfulness in destruction? See, there's an intensification there. First, it's just the grave. Then it is destruction, a land of destruction. He goes on, are your wonders known in the darkness, or your righteousness in the land of oblivion? Again, you can see the idea is being intensified with that second line in the couplet. Another way in which these couplets can develop ideas is that the second line can compare or contrast the idea of the first. So in Psalm 103, we see that the author is describing God. He says, as a father shows compassion to his children, so the Lord shows compassion to those who fear him. So the author is comparing a father that we all kind of know. We can understand the idea of a father having compassion on his children. And so he's linking that idea to how God has compassion on his children. But there's also a bit of a contrast. The father shows compassion just to his children, but the Lord shows compassion to all who fear him, not just the children of God, which in this case would have been the nation of Israel. Now, that's just a basic understanding, but there's all kinds of other ways in which the biblical authors are infusing the very structure of their poetry to get the reader to make connections with various different parts and to communicate different ideas. And there's all kinds of these different designs and structures. One of them is oftentimes a poem will begin and end with the exact same line. This is known as an inclusio. So in Psalm chapter 8, verse 1 is, our Lord, or O Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth. And that's exactly how the poem then ends. And so you can kind of see what the author wants you to focus on by bookending his poems with this line. There's another form of structure that's a little bit more complicated. It's known as a chiasm. And the structure of this is that the lines the line of the first will then be mirrored by the line of the second. And so the structure is A, B, B, A. And so in Luke chapter 1, we can actually see this in the Song of Zechariah. He says this in verse 71. He says that we should be saved from our enemies, okay, and from the hand of all who hate us, to show the mercy promised to our fathers, and to remember his holy covenant, the oath that he swore to our father, Abraham, to grant us that we, being delivered from the hand of our enemies, might serve him without fear. And so it's a little bit harder to see, but actually a Hebrew who understands the structure of their own people's poetry would pick up on this pretty quickly. You can see in this one, we have a structure of A, B, B, A. We have enemies, fathers, fathers, enemies. There's another one. We have oftentimes in poems, there is a particular phrase or group of lines that is repeated over and over again. And so in Psalm chapter 136, you can see that there's a line that's said over and over again. His steadfast love endures forever. His steadfast love endures forever. And this is called a refrain. And again, it kind of communicates to us what the author really wants us to walk away with. Now, for our purposes here, we're not trying to memorize each and every one of these design structures in the poetry that is in the Bible. What I want you to see is that the structure of the poetry itself is forcing you to slow down, or at the very least encouraging you to read through it slowly, to ponder on the various lines and images carefully, and to look at it from a lot of different angles to see what connections the author is trying to encourage you to make by the very structure of their writing. But there's another way in which the authors are trying to get us to slow down and to ponder what we are reading from very many different angles, and that is through the figurative language that they use, the metaphoric language that is used to ignite our imagination as we read. Because the language of poetry, unlike moral teaching or unlike oftentimes in narration, the language of poetry is trying to invoke an emotional response from you. Consider for an example, the story of Exodus 14, a very common story that we know very well of Moses parting the Red Sea. Well, we have the narration of those events in chapter 14, and then in Exodus 15, we have a poetic retelling of those events. And listen to the different purposes of each of these forms of literature. So in Exodus 14, we read this. Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord drove the sea back by a strong east wind all night, and made the sea dry land, and the waters were divided. And the people of Israel went into the midst of the sea on dry ground, the waters being a wall to them on their right hand and on their left. Now, okay, so that was kind of lengthy. Now see how the poem in Exodus 15 tells that exact same story, but it's evoking so much more emotion and experience and imagery. It says this, at the blast of your nostrils, the waters piled up. The floods stood up in a heap. The deeps congealed in the heart of the sea. I mean, it's telling the same story, but do you see how it's getting at it from a very different way? And the tools that the author is using is figurative language, is by way of metaphor. Now, you need to remember that the biblical authors lived in a very different culture than ours, and so their imagery will reflect their culture. And so one very common image throughout the poetry in the Bible is this idea of waters, the oceans, the seas, the raging waters. Because in biblical times, and for the Hebrew people, this was an image of chaos, of destructive forces. And we can see that in the poetry that is written. And so in Psalm chapter 69, we hear this, "Save me, O God, for the waters have come up to my neck. I sink in deep mire where there is no foothold. I have come into deep waters, and the flood sweeps over me." So we have this sense of someone drowning in the waters. But what the author is actually talking about is being surrounded by your enemies. We see that just one verse later. "More in number than the hairs of my head are those who hate me without cause. Mighty are those who would destroy me, those who attack me with lies." So you can see how this image of waters is meant to describe destructive people who want your harm. But it's so much more than just telling us that you have very many enemies, but through poetry we get to experiencing it in a new way. So we could go on and on for hours talking about how to read poetry, and really that's kind of the point. Because this is not a type of literature that you won't just read the book of Psalms once and say, I've got it. I got the information that it was trying to communicate to me. That's not the purpose of this type of literature. This type of poetry wants to invite you to chew on it, to spend long periods of time pondering it slowly, looking at the images, looking deeply at the images that the author is painting for you through its artful use of words and structure and inclusio and chiasm and refrain, all of these different elements. It invites us to really live in the text and to experience it in a different way than just than a story would, or that moral discourse would. This is the purpose of poetry in the Bible, and by this avenue, it shapes how we think and how we act by inviting us to really engage and participate in it in a very visceral way, to discover the connections by way of structure and metaphor and the words that they use, and to evoke an emotional, experiential response from you. And so we'll leave it at that. This is a great starting point, as you have a few tools in your belt as you read through the various poems in the Bible. But primarily, now that you know what you're looking for, it's not about downloading content. It's about being in the text and experiencing it in a very imaginative way. Next week, we'll maybe go back to what is a comfort zone for a lot of us. We're going to go to and look at the genre of discourse, oftentimes known as moral instruction. Really, this is what we think most of the Bible is, but it's only a quarter of the pages in our scriptures is actually this form of literature. But it is a very important form, because a lot of what we call the New Testament is filled with this kind of literature. And we think that we know how to read it. But I think what we'll see next week is that there's a lot of things that we can still learn about it. So thank you so much for engaging this with me. As always, I would love to connect with you in some way. Visit us on our Facebook page. Check out our website. Check out our other video series that we are offering. If this is the first time you've looked at a Reading the Bible, we have a whole series. Next week we are finishing it up, and I look forward to wrapping things up with you over the next week. So may God be with you as you read his story, and may it form you in the way that you act and think to be more and more like Jesus. We'll see you next week.